In the case of Dawkins, in this current controversy, he has not been truthful. Okay, all it did was, all he should have done was to take exactly 5 minutes. Everything I quoted, the curriculum in class 12, what is taught in NIOS in class 10, everything is there on the internet. Okay, a Google search, less than 2 minutes, you'd have found the answer himself. He did not do that. Okay, so that means he was not interested in the truth. He was seeking confirmation bias. Okay, he has a certain ideological bias, and then he was seeking confirmation for that. Okay, that's why when the Indian leftists ran a very systematic campaign, very well orchestrated campaign, he immediately fell for the bait, and then he straight away tweeted that all over the world. Did he single out India? Okay, and I think yes. Okay, and then is it because of bias? I think absolutely yes.
Namaste, everybody, and welcome to Sangam Talks. And today we have with us the ever articulate and ever enlightening Sri Kalavai Venkatji. And he's given many other talks on Sangam, and they've always been eye-opening, whether it's the Gyanvapi case, the Nupur Sharma controversy, or Christianity. We have Kalavaiji speaking on a very, very important and current topic, which is doing the rounds today on social media and Twitter. So it's about the tweet by Dr. Richard Dawkins, a renowned biologist, and his tweet where he compares Hinduism with Islam, and he spreads this fake news that the chapter on evolution has been removed from Indian textbooks. And then he brings in criticism of Modi and his Hinduism and Hindutva government, and then he kind of portrays a negative image of Hinduism. So all those things coming from a so-called renowned biologist, and he peddles these kind of fake news. So what is this whole controversy, and what is it? What is the truth behind all of it?
Namaste, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me start with the overall background to this controversy. But before I go there, I just want to make one thing very clear, okay, that I have no personal grudge against Richard Dawkins. And in fact, he's a scientist whom I have admired a lot over the last many decades, starting from my teenage when I started reading his first book, Selfish Gene. I have been a big fan of Richard Dawkins. And even in my books in the past, I have cited his work in evolutionary biology, his other polemical works like The God Delusion. I have cited all of those things. So I am not opposed to Richard Dawkins as a person, and I am also not opposed to the teaching of evolution. Okay, I am a very scientific person, and I always insist that, as society, we should be rational, and evolution is part of making society rational. And I've always insisted on teaching evolution, and I'm completely opposed to some of the nonsense that goes on in the West, especially in the United States of America, where there is a lot of pressure, there is a lot of propaganda, especially from the Christian lobby, but increasingly from the Muslims too, where they want to teach creationism, and then they sell it under different, in different packages like intelligent design, everything. I am opposed to all of those things. Okay, and here is the tweet from Richard Dawkins, and everyone can read that. But let me set a little bit of context. A few days ago, a group of leftist activists from India, they started a campaign. Okay, they started a campaign with an open letter where they claimed that Indian government has dropped the teaching of evolution from textbooks. And then this campaign gathered something like 1,800 signatures. And then they worked very closely with the media, not just Indian media, but also international media. And then this was amplified, and then this was propagated around the world. And one of the media publications that carried this campaign was Nature. Nature claimed that India has cut periodic table and evolution from school textbooks. And then it claimed, if you look at the byline, it claimed it won't be taught to kids under 16. Okay. So this is the background of the entire controversy. And then this campaign and this headline from Nature caught the attention of Richard Dawkins. And then he responded saying that, Modi's BJP is an affront to India's secularism and all of those things. And then he goes about dissing Hinduism, and he calls it a ridiculous religion and idiotic religion and everything. Okay. First of all, I don't believe Richard Dawkins knows anything about Hinduism, and I don't think he knows much about Islam either. But that's a different point. I'm not going to discuss all of his accusation in this, but there is one I want to focus on. Is Richard Dawkins correct in his understanding that Indian government has dropped the teaching of evolution in school textbooks? Okay. That's going to be the first one. And then as part of that, I'm also going to bring up whether evolution itself is something which Hindus in India ever opposed, or is it consonant with Hindu worldview, or is the Hindu mindset and the worldview similar to that of Christians? I want to touch upon all of these things today. So let me start with the very first one. The first question to answer is, did the Indian government drop the teaching of evolution from textbooks? So the answer is no, but I want to explain a little bit further. What happened is, let's take a look at the NCERT, okay, which is the body, educational body, whose directive is under criticism. Let's look at it, and let's look at what they are teaching in terms of evolution in class 12. This is what they are teaching. They teach genetics and evolution. They are teaching the principles of inheritance and variation, and you can read all of those things that they are teaching under that. Then they are also bringing up examples like, Klinefelter's syndrome and all of these things to demonstrate to the students, not just the foundational theory, but also how it is having application in medical sciences. Then they teach the molecular basis of inheritance, so that inheritance is not just the theory. They take it all the way down to the molecular level of molecular biology and how gene expressions happen and everything. So students get a thorough grounding of inheritance, genetics, and molecular biology. Then they go to chapter 7, which is evolution, where they start teaching everything about evolution. They start with Darwinian evolution, neo-Darwinism, which is the more recent thing. And then they talk about the evidence for evolution. And then they are not just stopping with presenting a few evidences, but they look into paleontology, they look at anatomical evidence, embryology, genetic and molecular evidence, everything. It's very comprehensive. Then they talk about mutation, recombination, etc. Then they go into the depth of natural selection process, and they go into Hardy-Weinberg principle and everything, and they focus heavily on human evolution. Okay. So when you look at this, this is what is taught in class 12, okay, of NCERT. And this is very, very comprehensive. And if all one has to do is take something like advanced placement or AP biology taught in the United States, which is comparable to this. And what you will find is that's also taught for 12th grade students. And what you will notice is what is taught by the NCERT is far more comprehensive and much more in-depth than what is taught in AP. And if the intent of the Indian government is to not teach evolution, or to cut it from textbooks, or to dilute its teachings, then they are not going to have a curriculum that's far more extensive, far more rigorous, and far more in-depth than what you find in the United States of America. So the first thing I want to make very clear is there is absolutely no intent to dilute or cut evolution from textbooks. That's exactly the reason the Indian textbooks have the most comprehensive teaching of evolution. And this is for the academic year 23-24. Look at the next slide. This is once again what percentage of marks, how much weightage is given to each subtopic in biology. And you can look at genetics and evolution, that gets 20 marks out of 70. That's almost 30%. So 30% of weightage is given to biology, is given to evolution and genetics. And for those who are familiar with the Indian schooling system, they will know how important this is. Because in India, even a 0.5% difference in marks will make all the difference between whether you get college admission or not. Okay, somebody could get 98% and could get into a college or a medical school or anything. Somebody who gets 97.5 might be denied. So that means in this 30% weightage given to evolution, if the students are not thoroughly grounded And if they are not thoroughly tested, and if they don't score full marks, they are not going to get into colleges of their choice. So this is the most important point I wanted to bring up. If the Indian government even had the slightest intent of diluting evolution, then they would not have assigned 30% weightage to the teaching of evolution and the marks scored on evolution in their class 12 examination, which is most critical in India, because unlike in the Western world, your performance throughout the K to 12 is taken into consideration for college admission. That's not the case in India. Only your grades in class 12 and then the entrance exam scores after class 12, that's the only thing that matters. So here you can look at once again, Indian government is emphasizing heavily on the teaching of evolution and the marks scored in evolution as a means to college admission. So once again, the impression that's being created that Indian government is trying to dilute evolution is a baseless one. This is the second point I wanted to bring up. And now, what is the real controversy all about? Okay, so earlier, evolution was taught both in class 10 and in class 12. Okay, class 10 was more of a primer, where they will just give a brief introduction to evolution, and then they will move on to class 12, where they will give a more comprehensive treatment of evolution, just like we saw in the previous slide. Okay, so this is what students will learn in class 12. So class 10 used to be very, very preliminary. However, during COVID, it was a very big challenge for most of the Indian students, because unlike the past, they were not going to the classroom anymore. They were taking most of their lessons on the internet, okay, which is a pedagogy Indian students are not at all used to. Okay. They don't have personalized coaching. They have no classroom interactions. And then they had to learn everything by self-learning or on internet lectures, which was very challenging for students across India. This was true of the high school students. This was true of the college students. And time and again, there was a lot of pressure on the administrators, on teachers, on the educational bodies to make it a little bit easier for the students by dropping some of the course content, and in some cases by even waiving the examinations. So that was the reason, not just the NCERT, even colleges started doing the same thing. They started taking some of the courses off. And in the Indian context, it is perfectly understandable, because there's a lot of variability. There are rural kids who may not even have a very good internet connection. And then it's going to become very challenging for them to do all of these things when they are in class 10. So they moved some of these to class 12, so that by the time the pandemic ends, the students would have gone into class 11 or 12, and they can now undergo the regular education, go to the classroom and get all the grounding. So their college admission chances are not affected, and then they are going to do well in the grade 12 public examination. This was the reason. This has been very well explained by the Minister of Education. His name is, I think, Subhas Bose, I think, or Subhas Sarkar. I'm sorry. His name is Subhas Sarkar. And then he explained this was done for not just evolution, for multiple subjects. For example, earlier, a little bit of calculus was taught in class 10, a little bit of statistics was taught. Those were moved to class 11 and 12. And similarly, if you take chemistry, they taught, for example, hydrogen, S-block elements, metallurgy, etc., which are all very critical today. If you look at alternative energy and everything, you need to know a lot about hydrogen. Without knowing that, you cannot come up with anything around hydrogen fuel. But even those subjects were removed from class 10, and then they were moved to class 11 or class 12. So it's not just about evolution. The entire idea here was to minimize some of the workload for the regular students, particularly rural students, etc., so that they are not put to disadvantage. And then when they go to 11th and 12th, they start from scratch on some of these topics like evolution, calculus, etc., and they can get a solid grounding. He gave an excellent explanation. I think that is a very reasonable explanation. And I think that explanation is once again proved by another factor, because when you take India, the central government runs two educational streams. One is the Central Board of Secondary Education, and the other one is known as NIOS. Okay, CBSE is the schools run by the government of India, but NIOS is the stream meant for students who are on the self-learning path and who may go to private tutors, etc. And they will study by themselves, and then they will come and take only the public exams. So those students are always well accustomed to using the internet. They are well accustomed to self-learning process. And then they also have a small classroom structure where they can go and work with the tutors, and then they can get all the clarifications and all the explanations, everything. So they were not impacted by this COVID. So in that case, in the case of NIOS, what is the government teaching in class 10? Look at the next slide. They are teaching everything about evolution in class 10. If you look at this slide, they are starting with Darwinian evolution and what was the contribution of Darwin and how the diversity of life is the result of the evolutionary process. They teach this. And look at the next one. Once again, they are talking about the ancestry, how all the living beings, look at the right at the top, they talk about how all the living beings share a common ancestry and how we inherited our traits through this ancestry through an evolutionary process. Look at the next one. They are talking about neo-Darwinism. They not only started with Darwin in the previous slide. Neo-Darwinism is what evolved in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, with more and more evidence coming from molecular biology, genetics, etc. They talk about that. Then they talk about the stages of human evolution. You know, how we human beings are, which is Homo sapiens sapiens, how we are related to all the other related species, and then how we evolved from that, how the tree of evolution looks like. They talk about all of these things. Then they are also talking about everything, including the theories of J.B.S. Haldane. J.B.S. Haldane is another very, very well-known, highly respected biologist, and Dawkins himself has written a lot about him. Okay, a lot of words of praise about J.B.S. Haldane. And students in 10th grade in NIOS, which is again a government body, central government body, it is teaching all of these things to students in grade 10. Why is that? As I explained, these students are already used to self-learning. They are already used to digital learning using the internet. And then they have an infrastructure of private tutors where they could get clarification. So the government decided not to dilute anything for them and then to keep it quite intense in class 10. But for the students who are going to the schools during the lockdown, when the schools were locked down and the students were compelled to stay at home and learn everything by themselves, that would have been a very big challenge because they were not used to the pedagogy of self-learning. They did not have the luxury of private tutors. They did not have, in many cases, even a stable internet. Okay, if you're a rural Indian, even your stable internet is a question mark. So in those cases, the government decided we'll drop it in class 10, but we will retain it in class 12. And as we saw earlier, the class 12 evolution and genetics is extremely intense in India. And I would even say it is much, much more intense than what is taught for class 12 students in the US or in any other part of the world. Then there is one more also point to remember. If you contrast the Western world, I'm going to take the United States as an example, and I'm going to contrast that with India. In India, we learn subjects very differently, not just evolution and biology. Take any subject, take calculus. Mostly you study that in just 2 years, okay? Grade 11 and grade 12. Then you take something like accounting or finance. These subjects are studied only in 2 years, 11th and 12th. It's intense. When you go to 11th and 12th, people take just 3 or 4 subjects. They don't take like 10 or 12 subjects like in the United States, but those 3 or 4 subjects are very intense and people have to cram up everything and learn everything in a couple of years. So that's the model we follow in India for the most part. Okay. In the US, it's very different. They will start from grade 6. They will teach a little bit every year, a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of mathematics, a little bit of stats, all the way up to 12th grade. The Indian model is different, and it's not something that the Modi government introduced. This has been the model we have always followed. And I don't think it has put Indians at any disadvantage because when you look at how Indians are doing in the Silicon Valley, how Indians are doing in the top American universities, they study up to 12th grade in India. In some cases, they go to college in India. They come to the US to work, or they come to the US for higher studies, and they do exceptionally well. So it's not putting Indians at any disadvantage, but that's the fundamental difference people have to understand. In India, most of subjects are learned in a just 1 or 2 year span of time when they go to 11th and 12th grade. And so when the government decided they are going to axe something from class 12, but add it to class 12, class 10 and add it to class 12, that was very consistent with the way the Indian education system has always worked. Now comes the next question. What is the impression that Dawkins' tweet was creating? So the impression it creates is Hindus, because that's why he's bringing up Hinduism. He's attacking Hinduism. He's not just attacking Modi. He's not just attacking the decision of the NCERT to not teach it in class 12, but he's making two important observations. He's attacking the Hindus, and he creates the impression that Hindus are opposed to the teaching of evolution. Then, second thing he's creating by quoting the Nature subtitle, that evolution won't be taught to 16-year-old kids or kids younger than 16-year-old. He's creating the impression that Hindus somehow want to hide the teaching of evolution from impressionable children. So is this a fair impression to create? And where is Dawkins coming from? To go there, to answer this question, we need to take a step back. So if you look at the US, I'm going to use US as an example, because this is where some of these most crazy things happen. In the US, the Christian right wing has always opposed the teaching of evolution. And it started not just in the US, it started right from the time of Charles Darwin. When Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, a lot of Christian clergymen, they opposed it. Okay, they used to make fun of him. They used to throw rhetorical arguments like, maybe you descended from a monkey, we did not. In fact, that itself is a wrong understanding. Okay, evolution does not teach that we descended from a monkey. It rather teaches that human beings and other primates descended from the same phylogenetic tree where we share a common ancestor. But starting from the time of Darwin, the Christian right, but in general, the Christian population also, they have always opposed the teaching of evolution. And in the US, it has been very intense over the last 2 decades or 3 decades, where there'll be sustained campaign to either ban the teaching of evolution from school textbooks or to surreptitiously introduce something like creationism or intelligent design and all of these things in textbooks. So as a result of that, Dawkins and others had to repeatedly fight the Christian fundamentalists and the creationist lobby in the US. But for that, we have to go into understanding why is that the Christians have opposed evolution. The reason for that is in their religious teaching. Christianity teaches a couple of things. Number one, it teaches God created human beings in his own image. And then it's a very earth-centric hypothesis, meaning earth is where all the actions happen. Jesus came as a savior on earth, and human beings are very special, and human beings were created in the image of God. And more importantly, Christianity denies that animals have souls. It says only humans have souls. And because of that, when somebody compares, when evolution says that we have a lot in common with animals and we are not all that special, and we just evolved like all the other animals, whether it's primates, whether it's fish, whether it's birds, dinosaurs, everything, that's a very revolting idea to Christians. And there is a second reason. Christianity has always taught that the world is very young. It's only 6,000 years old. Whereas evolution demolished that argument. It brought up the fossil evidence, it brought up the genetic evidence, everything to showcase that life on Earth has existed for 3 or 4 billion years. And that means the Earth itself is very old, and the geological evidence is once again confirming that. And this idea once again threatens the fundamental foundational beliefs of Christianity. So Christians have always opposed the teaching of evolution in the US. And increasingly, Muslims have also started doing that because Islam shares the same beliefs on creation with the Christians. So because of that, these two folks have always opposed the teaching of evolution. When you look at Hinduism, we do not have any of this baggage. We do not have any of these challenges. So what is the creation myth, or what is the creation point of view that Hinduism has? Look at the next slide. there is something called the Nasadiya Suktam. Okay, so Nasadiya Suktam talks about, it's part of the Rig Veda. Rig Veda is the oldest surviving text among the Hindus and probably the oldest surviving text in the world. It was compiled something like 4,000 years ago. And then it raises the question, it asks, how did everything come into existence? And then it starts with saying, in the beginning, there was no material universe. Then it goes on, and then it says, even gods came afterwards, meaning after the universe was created. Then it comes up with an even more tantalizing proclamation, perhaps the universe formed itself. And then it closes with the remark, maybe nobody knows. To me, this is beautiful because this is not dogmatic. And in the pre-scientific world, the sages and the poets who composed these verses did not have the benefit of modern science, modern mathematics, your telescopes, your measuring instruments, everything. But still, they did not come up with a very simplistic, dogmatic answer that God created the world. Instead, they said, maybe the universe formed itself. Then they said, even the gods came afterwards, the universe formed itself. And then they closed by saying, this is all speculation, maybe nobody knows. To me, this is beautiful. This is a very scientific temperament because science is not about giving a definitive answer. Most of the time, science flourishes because we ask a question, we do not know the answer, and we admit it openly. And then we put forth all the hypotheses. Then we go and search for data. We go and look for evidence, and then we go and prove it. And that's the mindset. That's the framework that the Nasadiya Sukta, demonstrates here. This is not a lone example. And this is something we find throughout. I'm going to talk about another example very briefly. One of the oldest systems of philosophies in Hinduism is called Sankhya. Okay? Sankhya probably started around 700, 800 BCE. That's like 27 or 2800 years ago. And then it grew in 2 or 3 different stages. But at the very beginning, Sankhya talks about creation. And it does not invoke God. Instead, it says there are 24 or 25 principles, depending on which version we are counting. It lists those principles, and then it says when these principles come together, that's when creation, cognition, everything happens. And when they talk about these, and that's why, in fact, the word Sankhya itself means enumeration. Okay, so it's an enumerative school of thinking. It's not a school of thinking based on a belief in God or some dogmatic proclamations. And in fact, that's why a lot of our ancient texts like the Mahabharata, they refer to Sankhya as Nirishwara Darshana, okay, which means non-theistic school of thought. Okay, it's one of the non-theistic schools of thoughts. And then that's how Sankhya was perceived. And once again, what you find is a very good parallel between what you see here in the Nasadiya Sukta and then Sankhya. Neither of them is invoking God. Neither of them is proclaiming a dogma. And both of them are talking about how universe could have come into existence and how we might have all evolved out of that, but doing it in a way which is quite consonant with the modern scientific thinking, even though they did not have the benefit of modern science. This is the first thing. Then, in terms of the time scale, we earlier talked about, right? One of the 2 reasons why Christians and then Muslims, they oppose evolution is their religions teach that the world existed only for the world came into existence just 6,000 years ago. That's the reason they oppose. Whereas Hindus have always subscribed to a concept called yuga. Okay, there are 4 yugas, but then these yugas are cyclical. Okay, everything gets created and then it gets dissolved and then it again gets created and then everything evolves, again gets dissolved. It goes in cycles and cycles and cycles. And increasingly, at least some of the modern cosmologists are coming up with the same point of view. Okay, they are also saying that there is a possibility that the universe expands and then contracts to a point of singularity, and then everything could restart again. Okay, then this is why Carl Sagan was a cosmologist, astronomer, and even more importantly, a scientist who popularized physics and science in general. He wrote a brilliant book called The Cosmos. There he says the Hindu religion is the only one of the world's great faiths dedicated to the idea that the cosmos itself undergoes an immense, indeed an infinite number of deaths and rebirths. It's the only religion in which the time scales correspond to those of modern scientific cosmology. Its cycles run from our ordinary day and night to a day and night of Brahma, which is 8.64 billion years long, longer than the age of the Earth or the Sun, and about half the time since the Big Bang. So in other words, modern science informs us that the Big Bang happened and the universe came into existence about 14 billion years ago. And unlike Christians and Muslims who think that the world came into existence 6,000 years ago, our ancestors, even 4,000 years ago, thought that our universe could be billions of years old. So we do not have any problem with an old universe, okay, an universe that has existed for billions of years, an Earth that has existed for billions of years, and the entire notion that all of the creation and all of the evolution happen without any divine intervention. Hindus have absolutely no problem with that. Okay, so that's why Hindus have never opposed evolution in their entire history, and instead they have come up with models that are quite consonant with the modern evolution theory. I want to bring up one more example. Why Hindus are not opposed to evolution? The answer lies in the concept of reincarnation and the law of karma. So Hindus believe that your soul is indestructible. And this is affirmed time and again in a lot of texts in the Bhagavad Gita, it's there in the Upanishads, and it's there in the Vedanta, it's in multiple schools of thought within Hinduism. The thought here is Atman. Atman is a Sanskrit word. Soul is not an accurate translation, but since you are speaking English, I'm going to just translate it as soul. Hinduism teaches that your soul is indestructible. And the body is merely a covering. And then we will reincarnate when this body dies, because the soul is eternal, and we will reincarnate in another body. And why and how we reincarnate? Based on the karma. Okay? If you do good deeds, you will reincarnate and have a better birth. And if you do a terrible deed, then you will reincarnate and have a terrible birth. And this is not only confined to human beings. Hinduism also believes that every organism, whether it's a tree, whether it is an animal, whether it's a fish or anything, they all have Atman. Okay? They all have a soul. That's why a human being could be reborn as an animal, and an animal could be reborn as a human being. This is precisely the reason we see divinity in everything. So, for example, we not only worship Ganesha, who's the elephant-headed god, but go to any temple, especially in South India, eastern part of India, etc. There is the concept of temple elephant. Okay, and human beings worship that elephant. Okay, it's not just Ganesha; we worship that elephant. So we see divinity in everything, and for Hindus, since you could yourself reincarnate as an animal, or an elephant today could be reborn as a human being, or a cow. Cow is again a sacred animal in Hinduism. Okay, we worship the cow. Okay, we just don't treat it as a pet. We actually worship it because the cow is not just a life giver. She not only plays the role of a surrogate mother, but she is also divine. The reason for that is a cow and a human beings are only separated by the body, but we share the same Atman. In fact, that is the entire thought that goes into the creation of ideas like vegetarianism, or ahimsa, because where we did not want to harm another living being for our own comforts. So Hindus do not have any problem with the idea that a human being, an animal, a bird, or a fish all share the same ancestry, and then they all descended down the same phylogenetic tree. We do not have any problem with it. That's the reason we will never oppose that, and we have never opposed it. I want to bring up one more point. The concept of avatara. Avatara is a Sanskrit word. It roughly means incarnation. Okay, so God or gods, they incarnate as human beings, and then they play a particular role. So this is quite a central belief in theistic schools of Hinduism. Okay, it's not there in the non-theistic schools like Sankhya and others, but it's very much there in the theistic schools of Hinduism. And when we talk of the avatara, or the incarnation of God, there are some of these avatars, like Matsya avatara, Kurma avatara, Varaha avatara. Okay? So Matsya is fish, Okay, Kurma is tortoise. And then Varaha is boar. Okay, and then we have no problem visualizing our gods, our divinities, in the form of animals, in the form of fish, and in the form of anything else, including trees, rivers, and everything. That's why the river Ganga, or Ganges in English, is called Mother Ganga and worshipped. Okay, and we don't just treat it as a body of water, we worship that. Same with Kaveri. Go to South India, Kaveri is treated as a goddess and worshipped. Or you go to Rameshwaram, you have a lot of what is called Tirtha, or the water bodies, which are all sacred water bodies. We worship them. So we see divinity in everything. And if we have no problem in visualizing God Vishnu in the form of a fish, in the form of a tortoise, in the form of a boar, then why would we have any problem at all with the concept of evolution? So that's another reason why we Hindus have never opposed evolution. And we have never petitioned anyone saying, hey, you don't teach evolution in school textbooks. Okay. Instead, the idea of evolution is something Hindus can very easily relate to, because that's what Hinduism has always, Hinduism has always taught things that are quite analogous to evolution and that are quite consonant with the theory of evolution. Now, I just want to address the byline in the tweet of Richard Dawkins. So in the byline, it says, let me show the byline again for the benefit of everyone, and let's respond to that. Look at this byline. Okay. Nature has learned that the periodic table as well as evolution won't be taught to under 16s. And again, as I already answered, it's not just evolution, it's also periodic table. It's also some of the mathematics, some of the statistics, some of chemistry that was removed from class 10 and added to class 12. However, the question here is, they created the wrong impression that we wanted to hide evolution from 16-year-olds. And I already answered that's not the case. But let's answer a bigger question. Should we teach evolution in lower grades? Forget 16-year-old, forget 14. Should we start teaching earlier on? My answer is going to be yes, but it's not a dogmatic yes. Okay, it's a more nuanced, better thought out yes. And what do we mean by that? Let's go back and ask a very fundamental question. What is the purpose of K-12 education? In India, a student starts education at the age of something like 5 and then completes schooling by the time he or she turns 17. So the purpose of education is give a solid foundation, okay, in multiple subjects, so that the student, by the time he or she is 17, has acquired all the basic frameworks, all the foundational knowledge, and the life skills required to survive beyond 12th grade until death. So this is not just limited to biology. This is not just limited to evolution. Take the modern world. Today, we are increasingly living in a world of artificial intelligence. And this will grow by leaps and bounds in the future. So that means if you are going to live in a world of AI, then you should be having a solid foundation in calculus, a solid foundation in statistics, a solid foundation in computing, a solid foundation in linear algebra. All of these things must be taught from grade 6 or grade 7, whenever it's most convenient. And in some form or fashion, India is already doing it. If you take something like IIT JEE Advanced or the NEET medical examination, most of the students start their preparation, I think, from class 8 or something like that. Okay. So, and I'm all for introducing that into the regular course curriculum as well and start these lessons early on. Second, take something like investment and finance. Okay, this is super critical for everyone, right? And this affects you for the rest of life. Just take the United States. US has a debt of over $30 trillion. And in fact, the US policies and then the US fiscal measures are one of the main reasons why there is so much of inflation, not only in the US, but around the world. Okay. So, in that case, most of the, and then we just, if you take the last 15 years, we have seen quite a few economic collapses. Okay. It started with, for example, the housing collapse, the mortgage collapse in 2008 because of the derivatives. And most people did not even understand what the derivatives meant. And a lot of people around the world suffered because of that. Or you take your investments, whether you put it in social security or your retirement savings or anything, most people, do not even know that, the 100 rupees or $100 you're saving today will not carry its value 20, 30 years down the line. So where should we invest? And do we understand the financial markets? Do we understand investment? Most of the kids do not. Most of the adults do not. This is true of India. This is true of Europe. This is true of America. And I would say that investment, finance, and everything should be taught from early childhood, from grade 6, because from 6th to 12th is the time when they're going to acquire all of these skills and expertise. Then take something else even more important, predatory wars. If you take the last 20 years, America has waged or has been instrumental in the creation of one war after the other. And most of the time, people don't even ask a very simple question that, is this morally justified? And the reason people don't ask that question is people are not given any foundational training in dharma, no foundational training in philosophy. So if they were taught all of those things, if the students are taught philosophy, if they are taught dharma from 6th grade to 12th, then they will start asking these questions around the world, not just in India, around the world, and we may end up creating a better world without wars, without any of these predatory wars that America and the West have been guilty of waging. Or you take something like COVID lockdowns. Okay, so in the COVID lockdowns, a lot of the small businesses went out of business. Okay, people became bankrupt, but big corporations like Uber, like Amazon, and others, Google, Facebook, everything, they grew by leaps and bounds, and they became a lot more profitable. Okay, in other words, the disparity of wealth and the concentration of wealth in a few hands happened right under COVID. But very few people even understood all of these things, and then they did not ask the question, if you are going to lock down our society, then how does it impact the economic well-being of everyone? So these questions could have been answered if people were given a more fundamental training in philosophy, in dharma and everything, where people are taught more of empathy. That's not the case. That's not something that happened. So I would say evolution is important, but evolution is not the only thing. We don't have to privilege evolution over and above everything. In the US or in the Western world, that may be a big issue because there is opposition to evolution. So scientists like Richard Dawkins think that they have to behave like activists, and they have to even behave dogmatically, and they have to privilege evolution above everything. But as far as India is concerned, there is no opposition to evolution, and hence evolution should be treated on par with a lot of other disciplines I talked about: mathematics, science, physics, investment, finance, accounting, everything, philosophy, dharma, and even yoga and meditation. Today, most of the people are dying because of stress, because of trauma, because of other disorders related to mind. And hence, something like yoga, something like meditation should become a part and parcel of your curriculum. There is no need to privilege evolution above everything. Treat evolution as a science, and that means you should not teach evolution dogmatically either. I'll take only one example for this. When you take evolution, a part of that is, how do traits manifest? Why do some traits get selected over the other? And there are two different competing explanations for that. One comes from Richard Dawkins himself. It's called gene expression, okay, or gene selection. Genes select and acquire better adaptive fitness, and then certain traits manifest. And a competing hypothesis came from another very respected biologist, E.O. Wilson. Wilson taught at Harvard, and he is one of the greatest entomologists and evolutionary biologists and sociobiologists. In fact, he invented the entire discipline of sociobiology, just like Newton had invented modern physics, and just like or calculus, to be precise. Okay, he invented calculus to explain a lot of these things. Like that, E.O. Wilson invented sociobiology, and I would even rate him as the greatest biologist of the last 100 years. And E.O. Wilson came up with a competing hypothesis or a competing explanation. It's called multi-level group selection. His hypothesis is traits are selected that bestow better adaptive fitness on the entire group. To take an example, if you take something like a pack of wolves, okay, wolves survive and die as a pack. Okay, when they go for hunting, there is one wolf that will go scouting, okay, and then he may even draw the prey, okay, closer, okay, and then that way he's putting his own life at risk. Okay, but the rest of the pack will be, forming a circle, and then they will ambush the prey, and then that's how they survive. So in other words, it's not your survival that matters, but it's the survival of the group that takes precedence over your survival. Okay, so E.O. Wilson's hypothesis is that multi-level group selection is what is responsible for the manifestation of traits. So now, if you are teaching biology, if you are teaching evolution, okay, in a very scientific manner, in a non-dogmatic fashion, I would like textbooks to teach both of these to the students and then present all the evidence, okay, for and against both the explanations, both the hypotheses. Let the students think about it, and maybe they won't get to the answer. Like the Rig Veda says, maybe nobody knows. Okay, let's have a lot of uncertainty in life. We are fine with that, but that's the scientific way of thinking. And I don't think Richard Dawkins is as scientific as he should be. In fact, I think he's quite dogmatic. And for that, I'll give one example. So some of you might have watched an interview between Bill Maher and Richard Dawkins about 6 months ago. It took place in December 2022. So Bill Maher was talking about the efficacy of COVID vaccines in preventing transmission. A very specific point, right? Do COVID vaccines prevent transmission? Then he brought up the studies of numerous scientists, okay, like Michael Levitt, Stanford professor and Nobel Prize winner in medicine, okay, not an ordinary person. And then the studies of Jay Bhattacharya, professor of epidemiology in Stanford, okay, then Monica Gandhi, many others, okay, UCSF professor. Then they came up with a study called the Great Barrington Declaration that was signed by 16,000 scientists and the doctors, okay, based on very comprehensive set of evidence from around the world. And then it showed that COVID vaccines did not prevent transmission. So when Bill Maher brought up this question, Richard Dawkins admitted that he had not even heard about this study. Okay? And that was quite surprising to me because this is his own domain. This is life sciences, his own domain. Okay, I would have expected that someone like Richard Dawkins, who is an advocate of vaccine. I'm also an advocate of vaccine. Okay, I'm not an anti-vaccine. I support vaccines. So does Bill Maher. Okay, we all support vaccines. In India, nobody opposes vaccines, right? We all get vaccinated from childhood. Okay, and all I would like to know is the vaccine effective? What does the evidence say? Is the vaccine having some harmful consequences that I should be aware of? What does the evidence say? That's all I care about. Okay, so in the case of Dawkins, he's an advocate of vaccines. So I would have expected that he would have paid attention to the Great Barrington Declaration. Okay, and he need not agree with that. Okay, he could have analyzed all the data and say, yes, I went through that. I completely disagree with those 16,000 scientists and doctors. Okay, and here are the reasons. Okay, yes, the COVID vaccines actually prevented transmission. He could have taken that stance. I would have respected that. That's what science is all about. Science is not about conformance. Science is not about generating a consensus. Science is all about coming up with exceptions and explaining that and establishing the theory. This is something the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran even explains, right? A lot of the neurological conditions, psychological conditions, mental health conditions are not explained by the general rule, but rather by the exception to that. That's what throws light on it, on the phenomenon. But Dawkins did not even pay attention to that. Okay, and instead, during the conversation with Bill Maher, he tried to change the conversation. He said, but measles, mumps vaccines are effective. And then Bill Maher had to cut him short. He said, I'm not talking about measles vaccines, mumps vaccines. I've taken all of those things. I'm talking about COVID vaccines. And I'm very specifically bringing up the point that COVID vaccines did not prevent transmission. And the data is conclusive on that. Okay, I cited the Great Barrington Declaration. Okay, and Dawkins did not even have a response. I'm fine with it. At that time, he had not heard about that. 6 months since, as somebody who advocated the COVID vaccines, as somebody who has been, holding position in UK as professor of public understanding of science, I would have expected Dawkins to go back and, research the Great Barrington Declaration, signed by 16,000 people, including Nobel Prize winners in medicine. Okay, then go back and say, look, did I get it wrong or did they get it wrong? Okay, and then come back and educate the world. He did not do that. That to me tells me he's as dogmatic as the creationists and the intelligent design proponents, he is fighting and battling all the time. The only difference is they are quoting, they are sticking to their ideology based on the Bible, okay, and they are not willing to pay any attention to evidence to the contrary. And Dawkins similarly has taken a certain position when it comes to something like COVID vaccine and transmission, and then he blindly sticks to that, and he is in denial about evidence to the contrary. So I think that is even more dangerous to modern world and to children, because children will be only taught one side of story, which will turn out to be propaganda, okay, and not be made to think scientifically. So those are the major points I wanted to bring up. So in conclusion, here is what I will say. Number one, evolution was not dropped from textbooks. That's completely bogus propaganda. Instead, because of COVID restrictions, when there had to be a rationalization and there was a crying need for minimizing the workload on students, it was moved from class 10 to class 12. And it was not only done for evolution, it was done for a lot of other disciplines. I mentioned a few examples from chemistry, from periodic table. You know, who will oppose periodic table? Not even Christians and Muslims, okay? And in fact, why will Hindus oppose periodic table? You know, Aravindan Neelakandan, the well-known writer, he actually wrote an essay yesterday where he pointed out the periodic table, the entire idea of isomorphism follows Paninian grammar, Ashtadhyayi, okay? So this is something, you know, we Hindus, we relish this, we love this, okay? So why will we oppose that? But it was not dropped. It was moved to 12th class for a very justifiable reason, because the students were now getting used to a new pedagogy on the internet, which they had never done before. Okay, and in the case of rural kids, it's even a bigger challenge because of internet unreliability. And in the case of NIOS students, they retained evolution in class 10, and it was quite rigorous, as I showed. And the reason for that was those students had already been used to internet learning and private tutorship, etc. And for them, it's not a problem. That's why the government did not drop it. To me, it's a very well-considered decision. Then second, Christians have an opposition to evolution because of religious reasons. Okay, Muslims have the same opposition. Hindus do not. Okay, in fact, the Hindu worldview, like I pointed out, is quite concerned with evolution. It's quite concerned with the modern, findings of cosmology. Okay, we believe that the world has been there. Universe came into existence billions of years ago, and probably it came into existence all by itself. And even gods came into existence after the universe came into existence. And we don't have any problem with evolution because of reincarnation, karma, and the way we portray our own divine incarnations. We see commonality between animals and human beings, and we think we all share the same soul or Atman. And the only difference is the body, and this body is changeable. You could be born a human being today and a fish tomorrow. We have no problem with it. So when somebody says that human beings and monkeys descended from the same phylogenetic tree, we will say there is no problem because we also worship Hanuman, the monkey god. Okay, we have no problem with that. Okay? So we don't have any such opposition to that. And finally, should we teach evolution to kids younger than 16? Why not? We should absolutely teach. But like I said, not as a dogma, okay, not as an activist measure, but you should teach it with all the other disciplines I talked about, from investment, accounting, finance, calculus, mathematics, physics, epidemiology. Okay, treat them statistics. Okay, without teaching statistics, how will students learn how to make inference? Okay, how to make logical inference? Okay, you should teach those things. Teach them linguistics, teach them philosophy, teach them yoga, teach them meditation. Okay, so teach them philosophy. That's what will make the world a better place to live in. That's what will give the solid foundation to students. And then that's what will prepare them for the life ahead of them. And India has to be a role model in this. So in that sense, I will completely support teaching evolution, not privileging it over all the others, treating it as one of the many, many, many scientific disciplines that should be taught to students.
Thank you so much, Kalaveji. The question is that, is Richard Dawkins somebody who should be interfering in any governmental decision of a sovereign country sitting in the US? I understand this whole perspective that scientists all over the world are connected and they're concerned about science and all these things. But then where does the line draw for governmental decisions not to be interfered by from outside agencies or people or this? And secondly, that is my first question. The second thing is that his one tweet goes viral and, it's published all over. And secondly, what India does with removing things from syllabus does not do with this, the government's decision. It starts getting traction in all these, I would say, a toolkit kind of a fashion everywhere. Now, what is the larger picture and conspiracy that you see into this, that this is being peddled as, removing evolution when it's not? Do you see this as a run up to defaming a particular religion, of course? And he brings in religion also, being an atheist, supposedly. And
Right.
how does an education curriculum, how do you bring in religion into it, is totally beyond my understanding. And when we have secular schools, as it's so called in India, and in that case, if you bring Hinduism in, then you should completely, I think, overhaul the entire education system, if that's how you look at it. If you think it's Hindutva oriented, that's what he's trying to portray through that thing.
Right. Let's start with the first question. Should someone like, by the way, Richard Dawkins is based in UK. Okay, so he taught it and retired from Oxford. So he lives in UK. I think he lives in Oxford. So he lives in UK. Okay, but he has traveled a lot to the US, and he has also studied in the US, and then he has lectured a lot in the US as well. I would consider him a very international personality in that regard. Okay, so now the first question is, should Richard Dawkins comment on or interfere with the decisions of another sovereign government? Okay. So I'll ask another question. Okay, so the US government earlier under Donald Trump and subsequently under Joe Biden, okay, took a lot of decisions on COVID, okay, lockdowns, okay, vaccines, okay, and then vaccine mandate and everything, okay, and then mask mandate and all these things, okay. And many of them have been questioned since then. Okay. But did we, I live in the US, but did Indians have the right to comment on it? I would say yes. Okay. Because the reason is twofold. Okay. Because some of the decisions, okay, impact everyone in the world. It may start with the US, but what the US does, others will start imitating, and hence others have every right to comment on it. Okay. But there is another reason also, as human beings, if we think that if you are not very parochial in our thinking, okay, and if we are not saying, look, I don't care what happens to others. Okay. So for example, as you are aware, I'm a big critic of Islam and Christianity, right? And I don't agree with the argument, oh, it's Islam, let Muslims worry about it. Why are you bothering? No, I'll bother about it because Islam is just an identity they acquired by the accident of the birth. Okay. Being a Muslim is only an identity they acquired by the accident of birth. And then those people suffer, those women suffer in particular, and hence I have every right to speak up and hope for the liberation. So I think in the place I will say, whether it's a sovereign country or not, or an educational body or not, I think we all, not just Dawkins, we all have the right and responsibility to discuss that and talk about that, because when we do that, we may educate others, and we may also end up getting educated. However, it should be done truthfully. Okay, that's the most important thing. In the case of Dawkins, in this current controversy, he has not been truthful. Okay, all he should have done was to take exactly 5 minutes. Everything I quoted, the curriculum in class 12, what is taught in NIOS in class 10, everything is there on the internet. Okay, a Google search, less than 2 minutes, he would have found the answer himself. He did not do that. Okay, so that means he was not interested in the truth. He was seeking confirmation bias. Okay, he has a certain ideological bias, and then he was seeking confirmation for that. Okay, that's why when the Indian leftists ran a very systematic campaign, very well orchestrated campaign, he immediately fell for the bait, and then he straight away tweeted that all over the world. Okay, so my answer would be yes. Dawkins maybe an Englishman, he may be living in Oxford, okay, but he has every right to comment about what happens in the US or in India or in Namibia or any other country. And so do we Indians have the right to do the same thing.
The US and the allied countries, they influence a lot of power over the United Nations, and that's how it's infiltrated into the other countries. So it's not just a decision there, it goes on perforating into other countries. So
Right.
yeah, that ways we had a right to question them, because ultimately it's going to come on us. The second thing you mentioned about the, I don't see him talking about education policies in China or, Korea and all these things. It's
That's a
just
good
about.
point. Yeah.
And secondly, when you talk about the second thing where you mentioned that, he has a, exactly my point, that the leftists picked them up, and then whether he fell for it or he initiated it, and bringing Hinduism into it, I see something which is beyond just science here.
Even an issue, right, which is in another country, a responsible scientist or even a responsible human being should learn about that and comment. Okay, for example, let's say you go on a tour of Greece, okay, and then you find something that's not done well to preserve those monuments. You have the right to comment on it. Okay, so you don't have to say, look, I'm a Greek person, I'm an Indian, not a Greek citizen, so why should I comment? Okay, so I think so long as we are truthful, it's absolutely welcome. Okay, but coming to the second point, did he single out India? Okay, and I think yes. Okay, and then you said because of bias. I think absolutely yes. I think there are two types of bias here. Okay, one is a leftist bias. So he uncritically, amplified the false propaganda launched by Indian leftists. Okay, and Indian leftists have been doing this for a long time. Okay, it's not the first time they did it. Okay, they launch a false propaganda, and then they have their collaborators in the West, the media in the West, that will amplify this propaganda. Okay, so on the same day, multiple media houses will publish something. Okay, and then they'll amplify that. So, but he took that without any problem. Okay, but second, there is another bias he carries. Okay, he is an atheist, but he also identifies himself as a cultural Christian, and he has actually gone on record saying that he supports the teaching of the Bible in school, but he is opposed to the teaching of Hinduism or Buddhism in schools. Okay, so this is absolutely ridiculous. Okay, because why the Bible? Okay, what is, if you're a scientific person, Bible is one of the most obscurantist texts. Okay, and the Bible has got brutality, misogyny, okay, intolerance. Okay, it's a genocidal text, and then it targets everyone who's a non-believer. And then Jesus himself was dyed in the wool racist. He was racist to the bone marrow. Just look at Mark 7:27, right? And then what does he say? And that is a woman, a Syrophoenician woman, meaning a pagan. She goes to Jesus. She's a non-believer. And then Jesus was a faith healer. So in those days, 2000 years ago, in Palestine, in Israel, faith healing was medicine. Okay, so she goes and her daughter is dying, and then she wants Jesus to save her through his miracles. Jesus says no. He says, my miraculous powers are only meant for my children, that is the Jewish people who are following my belief, and it is not meant for dogs, that is the Syrophoenician woman, and then the non-believers, the pagans, are dogs. Okay, they are not even humans. Okay, that's what Jesus says. Now, why would anyone privilege teaching this text to students but not teaching Hinduism, which has got beautiful texts like yoga? Okay, for example, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, or Buddhist texts. Okay, there are countless texts in Buddhism, and all of these things have very practical application, beautiful philosophical foundations. And we talked a little bit about Advaita, right? And then the simulation hypothesis of Nick Bostrom. Okay, and some of those things are brilliant. It will be appealing to students, right? Like the Matrix movie appealed to everyone. Matrix movie is based on Advaita Vedanta, right? And then a lot of the students would think, what was that was different about the Eastern cultures? Okay, especially Hindu and Buddhist culture or the Jaina culture. And then they thought about all these things very differently from the Abrahamic people. Okay, they could have created a very different mindset, a very different way of looking at the world. So why would you refuse to teach? In fact, he openly says that I do not support teaching Hinduism or Buddhism to students, but I want to teach Christianity. Okay, so I think there is a solid bias here, a pro-Christian bias. Okay, and he is completely ignorant of Hinduism, Buddhism, or any of these religions, but he has got opinions about that. Okay, so I think that is a very dogmatic mind. That's not a scientific mind. Okay, he is a person who has undergone a lot of scientific training and he has held a lot of scientific positions, but he does not have a scientific mind. Okay, so on the first question, I think my answer is yes. One can criticize even the policies of other governments or other countries or other societies, but one has to be truthful, and one cannot be as dogmatic and as biased as Richard Dawkins is. Coming to your second question, was this used as a toolkit? Okay, is this used as a false propaganda to vilify Hinduism, to vilify, Hindutva government and all these things? The answer is absolutely yes. See, think of India. India has been colonized for the last 1300 years. It started around, 700s, okay, when Qasim invaded India, and then it continued. So first India was colonized by the Muslims, then it was colonized by European Christians. And both these colonizations were horrible. Okay. Numerous studies have come out, but one recent study that came out from Spain and London, okay, by two academics, shows that between 1880 and 1920, 165 million Indians died of starvation because of the British policies. Okay. This is nothing but genocide. This is willfully inflicted genocide. Put this in context. During World War II, during the Holocaust, over 6 years, about 6 million Jews died. That's 1 million Jew every year. In India, over 40 years span, 165 million Indians died. That's 4 million Indians dying every year for a 40-year period. This was terrible. And is Christianity responsible for this? Absolutely yes. Why? That's a brilliant book by Professor Philip Jenkins. And then he quotes how in England, in that same period, they were invoking the Bible to portray Indians as subhumans, okay, fit for extermination, fit for genocide, and how our property can all be taken and shipped to England, and we are not even, worthy of any consideration. And it was this mindset, this Christian mindset, that led to extreme destruction of Hindus. Now,
very similar to the Waqf Act today.
very much, right? So now Hindus were in their own country a subjugated people for nearly 13 centuries. And India became independent only in 1947. And even then it was not really independence. Okay, it was only transfer of power to Nehru, to Jawaharlal Nehru, okay, who told the American ambassador John Kenneth Galbraith that I am the last Englishman to rule India. He never saw himself as an Indian. Okay, and then Stanley Wolpert writes in his book, citing a lot of evidences, that both Motilal Nehru and Jawaharlal Nehru treated Indians contemptuously. For example, Motilal Nehru referred to Rabindranath Tagore and all of those great visionaries as those oily babus. Okay, because they put oil on their hair, he called them oily babus. Okay, these fellows, they thought of themselves as Englishmen. Okay, and then Nehru and Motilal, Jawaharlal Nehru and his father Motilal Nehru will strike and shove and kick Indians even if they came within physical proximity. Okay, they never thought of themselves as Indians.
Dr. Richard Dawkins in his tweet says that between Hinduism and Islam, they're both ridiculous, idiotic religions, and they have betrayed the ideals of Nehru and Gandhi.
Yeah. If kicking and shoving your fellow Indians, okay, and then declaring to an American that, I am the last Englishman to rule India, if those are the ideals, I don't want those ideals. Okay, but we should address that in a separate topic. Okay, that Dawkins doesn't understand any of these things. Okay, but let me just address 2 points related to that. So we Hindus have been a subjugated people for 1300 years. But look at what we did. Okay, as soon as we got independence, okay, we worked hard. Okay, and then we came up. Okay, and then today India is the software capital of the world. Okay, India is a booming economy, and then we are launching more satellites than the rest of the world combined every month. Okay, and the cost per kilometer of satellite is cheaper than running an auto rickshaw. Okay, that's what we have accomplished. So what is happening here is when they are opposing Hindutva or Hindu self-determination, they are actually indirectly telling, we will treat you with a bit of condescension, okay, so long as you behave like Gangadin. Okay, Gangadin was a poem written by Rudyard Kipling. Okay, there an Indian is portrayed. Gangadin is the Indian character. He is portrayed as dark faced. Okay, and then he is at the beck and call of the white master. So long as we are that, like Nehru was, okay, these people are extremely happy. The moment we assert ourselves, they turn vicious against us. So there is a racial and a colonial mindset in play here. And I will very openly say this: Dawkins was displaying latent racism and latent colonialism when they are attacking Hindu self-determination, and then they are glorifying Nehru. Now, we talked a little bit about, secularism, right? So what is secularism? Secularism is all about the fundamental premise of secularism is there is separation of religion and state. Okay. And in fact, this idea was taken to ridiculous extremes by another Harvard biologist, otherwise a great biologist. Okay. But just because you're a great biologist doesn't mean everything you say is correct. Okay. So outside the domain, you can say the dumbest things. And then he proposed something called NOMA, N-O-M-A. Okay. NOMA stands for, it's an acronym. It stands for non-overlapping magisterium. And then he argued that the magisterium of religion and the magisterium of society, are non-overlapping. They are completely different. Okay. So hence, government should not interfere with religion and religion should not interfere with government. And Richard Dawkins himself correctly criticized Stephen Jay Gould for this. Okay. He said this is a stupid idea. Okay. And why? And I can explain better than what Dawkins did, because what is religion dealing with? Religion is dealing with issues surrounding life, death, and beyond. Okay. That's exactly what governments are dealing with. That's exactly what science is dealing with. Why should it be different? That's why in Hinduism, we don't have this kind of an artificial, stupid delineation between religion and government. Okay. And in fact, if there is something good in religion, you take it. For example, if meditation is good, government should go and teach meditation to everyone. Okay. And then if teaching a philosophy that allows you to get more and more of become more and more empathic, then the government should go and teach it. Okay. So what's wrong with it? On the other hand, secularism is a very pseudo-scientific idea. Okay. Secularism comes up with a completely bogus premise that of NOMA, okay, non-overlapping magisteria, which Dawkins himself has criticized, but he will criticize from one side of the mouth when Stephen Jay Gould says that, but from the other side of the mouth, he will advocate secularism. I don't want secularism. Okay. It's a pseudo-scientific idea. I want a rational society. I want a society that is based on reason. I want a society that's based on empathy. I want a society that's open-minded, because there are so many things we do not know of today. Do we know what consciousness is? No, we don't. Right? Somebody like Roger Penrose and James Amroff, they have talked about consciousness being a quantum phenomenon. Okay. And which manifests itself in microtubules. That changes everything about our understanding of reality. That changes everything about our understanding of life, our understanding of evolution, everything goes out the window. Okay. So there is so much we do not know. Okay. We are probably scratching at the surface of knowledge. So the most important thing is open-mindedness, where we will listen to all the ideas. We don't have to be dogmatic. We don't have to cling on to anything, but we have to embrace that and we have to explore that. And secularism is a pseudo-scientific idea which runs against this very open-mindedness. Okay. So Dawkins, from that point of view, when he, to your second question, is this a toolkit? Yes, it's absolutely a toolkit, because it relies upon falsehood. It relies upon ideological bias, and then it relies upon pseudo-scientific portrayals, and it yearns for continuation of the old colonialism. Okay, where Hindus will still continue to be native informants. Okay, and we exist only for the purpose of being a Gangadin and serving the white master and supplying catalog brides to aging white people. Okay, so and that's the reason they don't go and attack something like the Philippines. Okay, because Filipinos are not asserting themselves. They are Christians. Okay, and then and hence they are not challenging the West, and so long as they don't challenge the West, they don't attack. But look at some of the African countries. Uganda, Uganda is now under attack by a lot of the Westerners. Okay. For example, they came up with a law that criminalizes homosexuality. I disagree with that law. Okay. Because Hinduism is not against homosexuality. In fact, the only religion in the world, okay, which has accepted homosexuality as something inclusive in society is Hinduism. If you take the Kama Sutra uses the word Tritiya Prakriti, okay, which in Sanskrit means the third nature. It divides the world into male, female, and the third nature. And then what we call all of this LGBTQ, everything, homosexuals, everything, falls under the Tritiya Prakriti or the third nature. And Arthashastra, another Hindu sacred text from 2300 years ago, it talks about punishments for anyone who harasses homosexuals. Okay? So Hinduism is the only religion that accepts all these things, and we give equal treatment to homosexuals. And so I completely disagree with the Ugandan law. But the point is, Ugandans did not come up with their prejudice against homosexuals all by themselves. They got it from Christianity. Okay, they got it from Islam. Okay, and they got it from the Bible. Bible is the fountainhead of all the homophobic prejudice in the world. Okay, it's the Bible that teaches that the homosexual should be killed and all of these things. Now, Richard Dawkins, and now the Western countries are attacking Uganda for this legislation, and which I think is totally hypocritical. If they denounce the Bible and if they denounce the teaching of Christianity to children, and they also go and criticize the Ugandan law, I'll say they are being honest. Okay, but look at somebody like Dawkins. He wants the Bible to be taught to children. The Bible that contains all this homophobia and stoning of the homosexuals and adulterers, everything to death and all of those things. And, he wants, and also there's one more thing he did, he did a ridiculous thing. Like he wrote an article called Atheists for Jesus and came up with a t-shirt. Okay. So in that, he portrayed Jesus as a very moral person, as a person who was a revolutionary thinker and whatnot, which is total rubbish. Okay. All he had to do was to go back and, read the Bible, which I don't think he has read properly. Okay. And a person who is calling everyone but his own Jewish people dogs and, swine and everything, he is not an exemplar of morality. Okay. And, but, Dawkins, because he is a product of Christianity. Even though he's an atheist today, he has not outgrown Christian thinking and his Christian conditioning. He wants atheists for Jesus. He wants to wear a t-shirt that proclaims atheists for Jesus. And then he wants to teach Bible to the children. But the same people will go and condemn Ugandan law. Okay. Now, that is not just double standards. That's racism all the way down to the bone marrow.
Kanavai-ji, you exposed Dawkins in such a way. I think this is an eye-opening talk. There are two things now before I end this. I'm sorry for pulling it so long. What actually the audience wants to know is what I've gathered from social media. Is this Soros? Because pardon me if I sound stupid, but people link everything to Soros. So is this Soros or some kind of, that whole ring that has Dawkins in its pocket, or is it just plain hatred for Hinduism and Islam by Dawkins, which allowed him to fall into the trap of this leftist anti-Hindu trap? What is, out of these two, what is it?
I generally don't like to second guess or impute motives. Okay. However, what I can tell is based on data available. Okay. One thing is this campaign was well orchestrated. Okay. It started with the Indian leftists. Okay. And within a matter of, I think 3 or 4 days, something like that, right? Or a week or something like that. It was picked up and reported in all the Western media. Okay. In social media, everything, and Twitter, whatnot, everything it happened. So that tells you there was a big orchestration going on. Okay. So contrast this with the Manipur violence, where the Christian mobs, killed the mighty Hindus, the Hindu tribals. That was not reported by anybody. Okay. So that means, this is a well orchestrated campaign. Okay. So that's absolutely for certain. And I do think any of these well orchestrated campaigns by social influencers and others takes money. Okay. Because, these are a lot of times the people who are indulging in these campaigns are going to benefit from it. Okay. And then monetary benefit is one aspect of it. So there is some kind of funding. Who funded? I have no idea. Was it George Soros? Was it somebody else? Who funded? I do not know. But there is an ecosystem which is funded by all of these suspicious characters. And then that ecosystem is behind this orchestration. That's number one. Then number two, The second part of the question you asked is about Dawkins. Is it hated for Hindus? Okay, it may not be hated for Hindus per se. Okay, and I want to be very clear about that, because if you look at the God delusion, and I don't recall the exact words, but I think that's a sign I'm aging. But then something like, that's also a book I read years ago. But there is one sentence he talks about the Hindus. Okay, and then he says, the highly respected and well-educated Hindus of the UK. Okay, and he has very positive opinion of the Hindus in UK. Probably those are the only Hindus he has interacted with. Okay, I don't know whether he has traveled extensively to India or even interacted with Indian Hindus or not, but he has interacted with the British Hindus, and he has very positive opinions of them. Okay, so I don't think he is a racist or particularly hateful of Hindus or any of those things. However, I think what is happening here is, as I earlier mentioned, one is he has his own Christian conditioning, okay, and he is completely ignorant of Hinduism and Buddhism or any of these Eastern religions. But there was a saying, right? I think it's attributed to Mark Twain, that when an ignorant person opens his mouth, he removes all doubts. Okay, so so that's what it is. So when you're ignorant about subject, don't talk about it. Okay, then, or at least go and learn about it before you talk. Okay, so in his case, he wanted to also seek attention, and then with kind of convulsive fit, he jumped into the fray, and then he tweeted. So I think what is happening here is, like a lot of the Western atheists, okay, not just Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens was similar to that. Okay, he wrote this book, God is Not Great. He did a great job of demolishing Christianity and Islam, which he is aware of, okay, which he has studied. Then he talks about, there is a chapter called There is No Eastern Religion as Alternative Either. Okay, and then there, what is it he is bringing up? He brings up two examples. Okay, for Buddhism, he says Dalai Lama in Dharamshala runs his setup like a dictator. Okay, and hence Buddhism is bad. Okay, now I don't know whether Dalai Lama runs it like a dictator, because he's highly venerated by not just the Tibetan Buddhists, but also Buddhists from the Western world and everyone. Okay, so, and I don't think he's a dictator, but regardless, even if he were a dictator, okay, and even if he is not a great person, is that the only measure you'll use to judge Buddhism? Okay, Buddhism has like a 2,400, 2,500 years of history, massive amount of texts, okay, massive amount of traditions, okay, theory of mind, which they are built upon, okay, all of that absolutely relevant even today. That's the reason neuroscientists work very closely with Buddhist monks to study all of these things, okay. And why will somebody not look at any of those things and take one example? Because Hitchens was completely ignorant of Buddhism. He has not studied anything. Intellectual laziness is not an excuse, but that's what he showed there, and he dismissed it. Then it's also confirmation bias. Same thing he did with Hinduism. With Hinduism, once again, you have all these scientific texts and tradition. Linguistics, where did linguistics originate? It originated with Ashtadhyayi, okay, with Panini. And in fact, Panini says there are others before him. Okay, so there's a long tradition, right, starting Panini. Okay, concepts like isomorphism, all the way up to Hemachandra Suri and everyone. And then you have these non-theistic schools of Hinduism, philosophies, okay, then Vedanta and all these things, yoga, meditation, theory of mind. Once again, Hinduism and Buddhism both contributed extensively to that. All of these things, nothing. What does he bring up? He brings up an anecdotal evidence of somebody who is a devotee of Sai Baba, okay, and then who claimed that the picture of Sai Baba that he or she had in the dormitory room could automatically make some sacred ash manifest. Okay, now once again, it's anecdotal evidence. It's a poor way to construct an argument against the religion or a system of thought. But even in that case, even in the case, let's say this is true, and let's pretend that this is what Sai Baba is all about. But regardless, okay, that's not the example you'll use to judge all of Hinduism. That's exactly what Hitchens did. And I think what I see is a common pattern among a lot of Western atheists. They know a little bit about Christianity and Islam, okay, and then they assume that all the other religions from the East are also similar to that. And then they look for one or two, anecdotal evidence that confirms their bias, and then they advertise. Okay, I think that is the fundamental problem with Dawkins, and I don't think he's a racist per se, But the worldview he has inherited is one which is deeply rooted in colonialism, which is deeply rooted in racism.